So that's a pleasure to see you again, even if remotely. And well, thanks anyway for being so kind to give the keynote talk to this conference now. I will be very brief in my introduction, that things we can all read. And I think you've got a very friendly web page where you introduce all your work, your publications. I think you're known to many for this book that has made quite some career on the new phenomenology. And you're known for many of the research agendas you're on. Perhaps simply let me add something. You're not only at St. Andrews, but you're also affiliated now with the University of Vienna in terms of working together with Jason and me in our research cluster, and that makes me extremely happy. So there is another advantage of having Jason Vienna as the site, and right now is the virtual site for that webinar, because it also allows us to bring you to the forefront of this discussion as somebody who's also got good connections with Vienna. Your talk today takes on a trope that is very well known, I guess, to everybody. The title, Which God Will Save Us, reflects discussions that are going back to Heidegger and some others, especially Heidegger. But you link it, as we will see in a minute, I guess, to the mythoi of science, which is something that has already been on the agenda in one or the other talk in the preceding session, where we've already heard some reflections on that was my son, where we've heard some reflections on divine science and the like, also about, at least in the background, about the prosthetic God Freud was talking about, which doesn't bring relief and true pleasure to humankind. And of course, religion, which is also, let's say, resurgent today in very, very different ways and in very different grades of rationality and irrationality. So more than 50 shades of rationality that separated with irrationality. But I think that will be the broad landscape you will introduce us today into. And I'm very thankful that I had this opportunity to introduce you so briefly. Please apologize. I'd simply say, Bruce, the floor is yours. Very welcome to the webinar.
Thank you very much, Michael. I want to start with a cut from the vocal group, Take 6. And I'm going to see if this works. So here we go. If we ever needed the Lord before, we sure do need him now. Oh, we sure do need him now. Oh, Lord, we sure do need him now. If we ever needed the Lord before. Well, one can say at this point that it seems like we would need something to save us, whether it's the Lord or some other thing. We face all kinds of things: pandemic, mass protests, racial riots, wildfires, 100-year floods happening every year, plunging economies, joblessness, emerging dictatorships, Google following your every move, and then, of course, the ubiquitous Trump. How in the world did we get here? What wasn't the promise of enlightenment reason a promise of salvation from all that ails us? Wasn't enlightenment supposed to bring negative freedom, freedom from all constraints? A promise that one day, sure enough, no more mysteries would remain. And in some kind of apocalyptic revelation, the deepest secrets of reality would finally be made plain. Human beings would be in control of their destinies. We could take human growth hormone and live forever. We could have our minds hooked up to computers and eventually know everything there is to know. And yet that hasn't exactly happened. The world that we thought we controlled is letting us know in very significant ways that's still in control. by way of wildfire, climate change, and uncontrolled viruses. The pandemic has made us realize that we are highly vulnerable, not merely to COVID, but to any other virus that comes along seemingly out of the blue. Getting a vaccine for this virus is the problem now, but we have no idea when the next virus will rise and when that vaccine will be ready. In terms of technology, while science promised us freedom, it has come with a surveillance culture that can track our every move and remember even our most embarrassing tweets. Most remarkable of our contemporary physics tells us the world is far more mysterious than anyone could ever have guessed, which makes us wonder if we could ever really understand the universe. Now, as I'm sitting here, I'm in the first glass and steel apartment building in the world. It was designed by architect Mies van der Rohe, built on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago between 1949 and 1951. I don't know if you can see the background here. Can people see the background behind me?
Yes, we can. The buildings?
Yeah, so what's behind me here is the John Hancock building. And then this is Lake Michigan here. Sorry, what was that?
There was someone on mute.
Okay.
You can continue. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, all right. So this was built at a time of great promise when people still spoke in reverent tones of what science says. World War II had been won by the Allied powers. Europe was being rebuilt by the Marshall Plan. The 1950s saw the development of the highway system in the United States, and transportation across the world was becoming affordable and common. For many American Republicans, this was a time for which they now long. Men were in charge, women still knew their place. Almost everyone went to church, and American values were largely unquestioned. Of course, Americans remained generally untroubled by the genocide of one group of people and the enslavement of another. They were aware, and probably still remain largely aware, that their wealth and success is primarily due to genocide and enslavement rather than their own virtue and the Protestant work ethic. Now, at the moment, for those of you who've been to Chicago, you would know that the street down the road from me is called the Magnificent Mile. It's Michigan Avenue, and it has all the luxury brand stores, Louis Vuitton, Gucci, Prada, and they've all been looted. Boards still cover the windows of every one of those stores. And every night, in fact, just this morning until about an hour ago, police cars are out there with their lights blazing, lined up in front of the buildings. And whatever one may think of the looting, one has to admit that they were looted because of a desperation on the part of African Americans who had been promised one sort of salvation after another for a century and a half. Virtually all those promises were broken. And of course, Black Lives Matter protests have been held throughout the world. This is not simply an American problem. There are certainly places where the racial divides are better than in Chicago, thankfully, but much of the world is racially divided. One might respond, but what about the theological turn or return to religion in academic circles? As important as that may be, it is largely an academic achievement. The actual reality is that religion in the West has lost most of its power in practical everyday terms. Just a few days ago, someone appointed to be the Roman Catholic Bishop of Duluth, Minnesota, had to step down because of sexual misbehavior that had come to light. The revelations of this sort continue to come forth. I've watched as the Roman Catholic Church in Belgium has been decimated by the sexual abuse scandals. As someone who now calls Scotland home, I am astounded at how many churches in Edinburgh lie empty. My former boss, Alan Torrance, has publicly said that he thinks the Church of Scotland has less than a decade before it no longer exists. Evangelicals, at least in the United States, have been rather gleeful in watching mainline denominations decline rapidly in the past few decades. Yet that trend now affects all evangelical churches in the West. Sadly, American evangelicals have largely squandered their right to speak of personal morality as being important, given their almost unquestioning support of Trump. As far as I can tell, the main difference between Europe and the United States is simply that the former is further along on the path. My own prediction is this: whatever emerges as Christianity in the coming decades will look rather different from what it does today. But I think this will be like Derrida's L'Avenir, something that we cannot imagine in advance and so cannot plan for its coming. And this brings me to the question of my paper. What do we mean by salvation? What does it mean to be saved? Saved from what? I spoke to a woman in her 90s yesterday, and she brightly told me that the rapture was about to take place and everything would be set aright. Of course, the flip side of that story is that all of those people who get left unraptured are in for 7 years of trouble and turmoil. Is that what Jesus meant by salvation? A few lucky people get airlifted out of the mess and everyone else gets Armageddon? Further, how does salvation work out in terms of Enlightenment, philosophy, and modern science? In what follows, I want to argue that religion, specifically Christianity, philosophy, and science, has never been fully clear about what salvation truly means. At the heart of the salvific mythoi of religion, philosophy, and science is the promise of freedom. Yet that freedom has never been fully articulated. Considering the limits of this paper, I will speak of reason and science as partaking of one sort of salvific mythology and contrast that to that of religion. No doubt the matter is much more complex than such a treatment can demonstrate. Yet my purpose is to show that at the end of the day, these two mythoi are actually not that different. That should not be so surprising if, as Nietzsche thinks, science borrows its light from Christianity. The salvific mythos can be found throughout Western culture. It is a commonplace to say that we in the West are in the business of finding ways to escape from the human condition, whereas those in the East are more interested in accepting it. That dichotomy is no doubt too simple, but clearly the Western expression of Christianity, Enlightenment philosophy, and modern science are salvific in nature. There is something from which we need redemption. What must one do to be saved? Well, this is a typically Protestant question, and the belief that goes along with it is that there's some sort of thing that you need to do and or believe in order to become a Christian, to be saved. Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox believers have some version of this, but I'm going to concentrate primarily on the Protestant version. Often this requirement is put in terms of asking Jesus to become your personal savior. Now, this is not something that is just to be found in American evangelicalism, because a remarkably similar formulation can be found in the baptismal covenant of the Book of Common Prayer used by the Episcopal Church in the United States of America, not exactly known as a conservative denomination. Baptismal candidates are asked a series of questions, one of which is, do you turn to Jesus Christ and accept him as your savior? The response is simply, I do. While there are many aspects of both of these ideas that could be considered, I'm more interested in the general belief that something must be done and something must be believed in order for one to be, and how should I put this, in. Exactly what one thinks needs to happen in order to be in depends on how one views salvation. For many, salvation mainly equals getting to heaven. Well, it no doubt includes that what Jesus calls the kingdom of God or kingdom of heaven can really mean something like the Jesus movement. Thus, when Jesus says to the scribe that he is not far off, as in you are not far off from the kingdom, Jesus is saying you are not far off from being part of my community of followers. In any case, that there truly is such a set of things that one must do and believe in order to become a Christian is so obvious to so many conservative Christians that it is simply taken for granted. Of course, as some of my colleagues from the theology department at my former institution discovered over the years, when they asked students to spell out exactly what these things were, there was considerable discrepancy. For many students, being asked such an explicit question about something for which they had long assumed they knew the answer turned out to be akin to Augustine's problem with the nature of time. And that is, as long as no one asks him, he knows exactly what it is. Specifying exactly what it is you must do and believe in actual practice to be a member of the household of faith turns out to be considerably harder than what most fervent believers often believe in the abstract. I begin with this general observation because I think it gets at the problem that is all too well exemplified in the Gospels. Specifically, Jesus himself is so difficult to pin down on what exactly is necessary to be part of the kingdom of heaven. Now, what I have just said will strike many conservatives as simply being wrong. Indeed, the most likely response will be, Jesus is quite clear that you must be born again. The passage in which Jesus uses this beautiful and moving metaphor is in John chapter 3, a passage that for many conservative Christians is the central tenet or core text of Christianity. But Nicodemus finds this notion very confusing, even though Jesus thinks he should simply get it. Jesus first answers Nicodemus by saying the following: "Very truly, I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God without being born of water and spirit. What is born of the flesh is flesh, and what is born of the spirit is spirit." What exactly does that mean, though? Then Jesus goes on to say something even more remarkable. "Do not be astonished that I said to you, you must be born from above. The wind blows where it chooses, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit." Whatever else one takes away from this passage, Jesus' point in verses 7 and 8 is precisely that the Spirit works as it wills, and so, as one conservative commentator puts it, we can neither control him nor understand him. Thus, once he's born of a spirit that we do not control or understand. Such a requirement deals a heavy blow to anyone who thinks that the power of Christianity is something to be mastered or to be controlled. No, says Jesus, it's quite the other way around. But from what are we being saved? Many Christians think that salvation is, to put it in Nietzschean terms, primarily otherworldly. It is about the life to come. The woman in her 90s I mentioned didn't say anything about those who are left behind. While dispensationalism is rather far away from Calvinism, it is just as exclusivistic. Some are in, some are out. If you're in the latter group, good luck to you. Yet this obvious answer is problematic. Growing up in a deeply evangelical family, I thought I knew what we were being saved from. Put another way, the things I was taught Christianity was turned out to be strikingly different from what Jesus actually says, which is much more complex. Jesus promises abundant life, but Christianity seems to be defined by its prohibitions. One thinks of H.L. Mencken's famous line that fundamentalism is no fun, all damn, and no mental. If you think my characterization is purely idiosyncratic, let me point out that while teaching at Wheaton College for 2 decades, I found that students were quite surprised when I'd say that Jesus was saying yes to life. Their assumption was that Christianity was all about depriving us from the fun of sin. Yes, students often said that they wished they could sin, even though they knew they were not supposed to do, because they assumed that sin would be much more fun than being good. When I countered with, well, Jesus prescribes such behavior because he thinks that we'll be happier and more fulfilled, they didn't quite know what to make of that. They had never thought of Jesus as giving life and freedom. Instead, they thought of him as taking them away. Moreover, it was never clear what we were being saved for. I think the right answer is something like this: to live in harmony with God and our neighbor, to experience shalom, or the peaceable kingdom. Yet such a goal was never articulated in my home, despite the fact that my father had a theological degree, or in any of the churches that I attended. Christianity was about avoiding something bad. As it turns out, the logic of salvation is not merely some Christian or even religious thing. It is also what animates scientific activity. Well, there is no question part of being a scientist is the desire to understand the world Simply because we're curious, human beings have never simply wanted to know out of curiosity. All men desire to know, writes Aristotle at the beginning of the Metaphysics, but knowledge also brings about power. Academics like to speak of knowledge for knowledge's sake, but most people are more practical than that. Consider what Nietzsche says about philosophical and scientific piety. In what way we too are still pious. We see that science too rests on a faith. There is simply no presuppositionless science. Willed truth does not mean I do not want to let myself be deceived, but there is no alternative. I will not deceive, not even myself. And with that, we stand on moral ground. But you will have gathered that what I'm getting at, namely that there is still a metaphysical faith upon which our faith in science rests, that even we knowers of today, we godless anti-metaphysicians, we still take our flame too from the flame lit by the 1,000-year-old faith, the Christian faith, which was also Plato's faith. For those of us who grew up in the West, the logic of salvation seems rather clear-cut. Something's wrong and it needs to be made right. We seek to be saved from some sort of defined ill, whether that be sin or poverty or physical, emotional suffering or eternal damnation. It's a commonplace that Western thinking has been obsessed with salvation, while Eastern thinking tends towards learning to accept all that besets us. As an example of the latter version, Schopenhauer tells us that, and here I'm quoting, true salvation, deliverance from life and suffering, cannot even be imagined without complete denial of life. Although this might sound like the antinatalist wisdom of Silenus, Schopenhauer is in effect preaching a salvation that avoids any sort of optimism and sees death as the most desirable state. Cheery fellow that he was. Nietzsche's idea of salvation differs from that of Schopenhauer in both his terms of his valiant attempt to be optimistic in opposition to Schopenhauer's pessimism, but also to escape from the very logic of salvation or redemption or Lösung. He wants to be saved from the desire to be saved and wants to be able to say yes and amen to whatever comes his way. While I'm uncomfortable saying that Marxism or capitalism are simply other forms of religion, I do think they buy into this salvific logic, this logic of salvation. Given that assumption, the Nietzschean conception of salvation from salvation seems wrong-headed, if it were only so simple as that. In my book, Pious Nietzsche, I've argued that Nietzsche moves from the German pietism of his youth to what he terms his Dionysian pietism. As a 13-year-old, Nietzsche had written, "Like a child, I trust in his grace. He will preserve us all that no misfortune may befall us. But his holy will be done. All he gives I will joyfully accept. Happiness and unhappiness, poverty and wealth, and boldly look even death in the face, which shall one day unite us in eternal joy and bliss. Yes, dear Lord, let thy face shine upon us forever. Amen." On my account, Nietzsche's voice here simply a resignation to all that God gives, but a joyful acceptance and even a welcoming of it. While the mature Nietzsche voices a similar acceptance of all that comes his way, there is still an important difference. In short, the 1980s Nietzsche does not think there is anything like a kind, loving God who orchestrates all that comes. Not only does he wish to be free from Christianity, we've also seen that he wishes to be free from the very hope of redemption. But in the end, can Nietzsche ever make such a move? It would seem that to be saved from salvation, redeemed from redemption, is once again to repeat the very logic from which one wishes to escape. Nietzsche does recognize that one cannot escape decadence merely by making war against it, as is clear from what he says of Socrates. But then how can Nietzsche truly escape from escaping, overcoming, redeem himself from redemption, or save himself from salvation? I believe that the most Nietzsche can do is to make a religious move, saying that all this can be accomplished by faith. Yet I've questioned whether Nietzsche's faith is truly strong enough. He hopes and prays to be free. He hopes and prays to be a true follower of Dionysus, but he knows he's unfaithful. So Nietzsche's last of multiple autobiographies, Ecce Homo, is an attempt to reinterpret his life as a faithful follower of Dionysus. It's a confession of faith and a confession of unfaithfulness. When Nietzsche claims that Ecce Homo is designed to tell us who I am, that claim is only partly right. Instead, it is desired to tell us who Nietzsche wishes to be. I am a disciple of the philosopher Dionysus, writes Nietzsche. Such is both what Nietzsche wants to be and what he hopes he will be someday. In effect, Nietzsche says, I believe, help my unbelief. Nietzsche is rightly interpreted as giving us an aesthetic creation of himself in Ecce Homo, a self that is constructed by masks and some sort of Rausch that takes himself out of oneself. But Ecce Homo also fits with Nietzsche's long history of prayer. In this case, not the prayer of the weak, but the prayer of the strong, the ones who are able to use songs and ritual to reinforce their strength. Nietzsche leaves himself and us with a deep dilemma. He speaks of a passive nihilism as characterized by Russian fatalism in Twilight of the Idols. In contrast, his goal is that of an active nihilism, in which one fights against overcoming nihilism, fights against the coming of nihilism. I've argued that in the end, this positions Nietzsche in a very difficult place. He wants to be able to say yes and amen to all that comes his way, and yet he wants to wage war against nihilism. Waging war may be at least potentially different from anger, pathological vulnerability, and impotent lust for revenge. And here I'm quoting from Nietzsche. The worry is that the warrior may also be harboring anger and the desire for revenge. The revenge or resentment, is that truly the opposite of warfare? In the sense that one acts either one way or the other? Nietzsche tells us that according to him, acting out of ressentiment is when one is denied the true reaction, that of the deed. In other words, ressentiment is reactionary, whereas true reaction simply acts. As Nietzsche goes on to say, the truly noble person is the one who acts out of a triumphant yes saying to oneself, whereas the weak person with the slave says no. The one who acts creatively, the one who acts without a kind of agenda. But having said all that, it is not all clear that waging war is necessarily a true deed, rather than being something reactionary. If Nietzsche is right here, and that would be granting him quite a bit, then he's drawing an extremely thin line. Does such a distinction really matter? Well, perhaps it does. But if so, it would seem to hold only de jure rather than de facto. While we do not need to answer this question regarding Nietzsche, we clearly need to ask it regarding ourselves. Well, what I mean here is relatively simple. Is salvation of whatever kind some sort of passive letting go and letting God, some sort of Gelassenheit, relief from toil and struggle? Or is it something we do or participate in? Here I mean to get at a tension that I have never understood within Christianity itself. Jesus teaches his followers, ask and ye shall receive. They are instructed to ask for their daily bread, for their sins to be forgiven, and yet they are also instructed to say, thy will be done. How is one to put together the asking with the desire that God's will be done? As I have often put it, if God is truly the Lord of the universe, wouldn't God's will be done quite apart from asking us that it may from us asking that it might happen? Evangelicals often pray for parking spots. Dear Lord, deliver us from having to walk too far to the mall. But that is not part of the great litany that we read every Ash Wednesday, at least in the Episcopal Church. Here are some examples of that. From lightning and tempest From earthquake and fire and flood, from plague and pestilence and famine, good Lord, deliver us. From all oppression, conspiracy and rebellion, from violence, battle and murder, and from dying suddenly and unprepared, good Lord, deliver us. By the way, I had intended to try and sing those verses, but I decided it maybe wasn't a good idea. Again, my question is, God is really supposed to save us from all of these things? If not, what's the point of asking God to do so? How does such supplication or request function? I don't think that God ever saves us from the ills of this world. Instead, as Moltmann has shown, Christ's death on the cross is an experience of suffering with us. The problem here concerns the relationship between life and death. What trauma studies have shown us, in trauma we encounter death. In the usual ways of reading redemption, whether religious or otherwise, death would seem to be something in which life concludes and begins again. In a philosophical view of Easter, Cornel West speaks of the dangers of reading death symbolized by the cross and life symbolized by resurrection in such a way. Writing on trauma, Shelley Rambo says the following: if resurrection is the event of new life in Christian theology, reconciling these claims with the experience of survival, in which life is not experienced as new or as better, is difficult. Insofar as resurrection is proclaimed as life conquering or life victorious over death, it does not speak of the realities of traumatic suffering. In fact, one must recognize the ways in which resurrection proclamations may gloss over and neglect the difficult experience of life in the aftermath of death. She goes on to say the trauma structure introduces what I refer to as the middle, the figurative site in which death and life are no longer bounded. Instead, the middle speaks to the perplexing space of survival. It is largely untheolized because the middle is overshadowed by the other two events. Because of its precarious positioning, the middle can easily be covered over and ignored. It is subject to the illusions of time, of body, and of language, and it is therefore difficult to witness. The good news of Christianity for those who experience trauma rests in the capacity to theologize this very middle. It does not rest in either the event of the cross or the resurrection, but instead it rests in the movements between the two, movements that identify through the concept of witness. The good news lies in the ability of Christian theology to witness between death and life and have an ability to forge a new discourse between the two. If Rambo's correct, then the ability to be saved is not about avoiding death and suffering, but living through these things. It is what Derrida terms savir, a kind of living on or living through. It is an excess that survives and goes beyond the limit of death. When I was growing up, I was told that all the good stuff that happened in the world was credited to God. As I've been packing up to move permanently to Scotland, I came across a book titled A Child's Thought of God, and here it is. And inside here, I have been given the ribbon for the highest honor in memory work. It was the result of learning all of those verses and saying them to Mrs. Bromley, whom I just thought at the time talked funny, and then later realized that she was the wife of the translator of Karl Barth. God made the beautiful earth and the wondrous body and so on, I was taught. That was certainly this child's view of God. Yet as an adult, I discovered that bad things like pandemics and lightning strikes were described as acts of God. On that view, God comes off looking rather bad. He's the guy responsible for pandemics and other things over which insurance companies have no control. Let me put this another way. Having grown up in the thick of American evangelicalism, I was taught that God had a plan for my life. Depending on whom one talked, one was told that this was something more general concerning career or marriage or some other kind of important life event, or else every little thing that ever happens. On such a view, if one prays enough, and I have to confess, I never figured out that part exactly, then God will show you exactly what to do. By prayer and supplication, God will save us from falling into the snares of the devil. As far as I can see, the evangelical subculture in which I was raised was largely designed to save us from the world and all of its evils. Yet the Bible I was taught to read in Greek made me realize that Jesus preaches something much more complex than this. The meek and the poor are said to be blessed. Does that mean that meekness and poverty are not things from which we are to be saved? The problem is that Jesus never really specifies exactly what it means to be saved. What he says about the kingdom is constantly unfolding in his own rhetoric, in the sense that he continually glosses what he's already said. In other words, he says, well, it's like this, and then he goes on to say, okay, let me try this again. Given that one way of defining deconstruction is a continual reformulation of what has already been said, we might say that Jesus is a kind of deconstructor. Yet this characteristic is not simply true of the kingdom of heaven as some kind of conception, but also, and more important, true of the kingdom of heaven or salvation as a way of life. Perhaps we might better say that it's something that can only be understood by being followed. Just as the call is only heard in the response, so the kingdom of heaven is only understood as it becomes a way of life. Thus, the way boils down to the continual working out of the kingdom on a daily basis, but in such a way that one may well be not far off from the kingdom, but never there. Kevin Hart's book, Kingdoms of God, reminds us that the kingdom of God is never simply at hand, already accomplished, but already always to come. Picking up on what I said earlier about being born again, I believe that Jesus is actually giving us something like a phenomenology of the kingdom, albeit not with paragraphs numbered like Heidegger's Being in Time, but an actual phenomenology nevertheless. Here I'm reminded of something Hans-Georg Gadamer says in trying to describe his phenomenological project in Truth and Method. He speaks of whatever happens to us over and above our wanting and doing. Reading a text might at first seem to be something that we can do and over which we have some control. While this is not simply inaccurate, it is, I think, too simple. For a genuine experience of a text happens precisely when one hears what the author says, and this experience often has the structure of a reversal. Gadamer speaks of the logical structure of openness as necessary for there to be any true understanding. He begins with the idea, one that goes back to Hegel, that genuine experience is always negative. It is when we do not expect something that we actually have an experience. Otherwise, we're simply reliving old experiences, seeing what we've always seen. This is why Gadamer says, strictly speaking, we can't have the same experience twice, even though we can continually experience a text in a new way and thus have a new experience. Yet this question can equally be asked of science. What is it designed to save us from? Is it something from ourselves? If that's the case, then technology that science has brought about has only exaggerated our worst characteristics. People talk about retail therapy, shopping in order to make one feel better. But such therapy allows us to act as unthinking consumers who discover that no purchase online is ever enough, and so leads to a sense of needing more, when the reality is we already have far more than we need. Does science arise from our anxiety of death? I think so. We seek cures not merely to what ails us, but to whatever will keep death from our door. We have the ability to save ourselves from death in a way that leaves us no longer alive in a normal sense. Does science purport to make us invincible? Well, I think so. We think that for any physical disease or threat, there should be some sort of cure. So much so that when the medical community is unable to deliver, we think of them as being somehow deficient. It's their responsibility to make sure we're untouched by the suffering of the reality of suffering and death. My worry, though, is that much of Christianity has bought into this kind of salvific message. Here, I don't mean simply Christians in the West, that they're invested in the scientific project of personal invincibility as much as anyone who is secular. Instead, I mean that the Christian message has been co-opted by such a vision. Whereas Jesus has radical words about economic injustice, many Christians simply do not see these words in the Gospels. It is a kind of hermeneutic blindness, what I've elsewhere termed a Prozac hermeneutic. Whereas Jesus seems to be quite determined to undermine and radically cross the boundaries of his day, most Christians seem to be more than happy to see them remain. I don't mean to suggest that Christianity either is or always has been this way. If we go back to the example of Wheaton, its first president was a radical abolitionist who hid escaping slaves in his home, a warrior in favor of women's rights, and a crusader against child labor. But Wheaton and evangelicalism joined the ranks of those who fervently uphold the status quo. Anti-immigration, promoting white privilege, failing to recognize any complicity in American slavery and a Native American genocide, and denying that human beings have any part to play in climate change. One might suggest that technology giants like Facebook and Google are, in an important sense, more progressive than most Christians. Although that is true, their progressivism is mainly based on a shrewd and calculated move that has to do with PR and sales. Large company, for instance, realized that the LGBTQ market was a big one, and there was no need to alienate potential customers. More important, social media firms have not brought us together. Instead, they have played on our worst inclinations of hate and division. Science has long been responsible for creating problems and then proposing itself as the savior to fix these problems. In one sense, it's a superb marketing plan because it remains indispensable. Thus, Mark Zuckerberg sees Facebook as its own answer. We need more Facebook, not less. At the end of the day, I worry that the analysis that Nietzsche uses regarding religion is better placed at technology's door. Nietzsche argues that the ascetic priests have created the category of sin and cast themselves as the role of saviors, a very neat and tidy formula. Yet science seems to operate more or less by the very same formula. Science has brought us climate change and all of its attendant ills, of out-of-control wildfires, 100-year floods that now happen almost every year, and hurricanes of a magnitude unthinkable in past years. While the Black Plague may have decimated Europe, international air travel makes it possible to have a true pandemic rather than merely a partial one. Many of the problems of the political landscape, whether worries of rigged elections, the rise of dictatorships, or racial tensions, have been aided and abetted by technology. Whatever other means Trump has used to fan the flames of racial division, Twitter has proven highly effective. Further, the freedom brought us by technology comes with a massive price. The literal tracking of our every move and the potential for Google or any foreign power to use the technology that put us in a virtual cage. Google provides us a mighty search engine, but its algorithm brings you whatever you want rather than opens you to what's outside of what you want. Finally, the freedom promised by science is almost entirely negative. We are freed from infantile belief in God, supposedly, but science offers nothing in the way of positive freedom. Put in Kantian terms, we are free to determine our ends. But what are those ends? Science provides no clues. It does not even know what it wants to save us from. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce, for this lecture, which has really touched on a manifold of issues that we had in mind when we crafted this call for papers. And well,
good.
I think it was a good decision. You were really able to weave things together and give us a good bunch of questions everybody wants to talk about. We have the chat where questions already have been posed.
Okay.
The first was Kochi Tarakan. I wonder if you would like to post the question live, that perhaps will give it a different tasted tone. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I mean, it was not so much of a question, it was just a concern whether is it appropriate to characterize the Eastern perspective as life denial. I mean, it was a passing remark of Bruce. So I just wanted to point out, is it really appropriate? My question, actually, you can see down where I posed the question from a Husserlian perspective, particularly keeping in mind the crisis of European science, the text. Do we really have to take science as embodying the notion of salvation? Is science really salvific from a phenomenology of Husserlian perspective? Thank you.
Okay, so let me start by saying I'm not sure I heard everything that you said, but I think I heard the important part. And let me add one other thing that it's probably significant for me to say. I'm here in this this lovely apartment building because I left Edinburgh with my boyfriend with the intention of coming to the United States to get married. We got as far as Frankfurt, and at the airport, people from the consulate said to us, oh, the way that he'll be able to get into the US is for you to go to Istanbul. So we spent the night in the airport in Frankfurt, then we went to Istanbul, discovered, we spent the night there. I actually went through to get the luggage. So I was on one side, he was on the other side. But then he was denied boarding to the plane. We decided in the split second of, the plane is about to close the doors, that I should come to the US. So I'm stuck here until I get my visa to go back to Edinburgh. And so I do not have access to any of my books in Edinburgh, which only constitutes a library of maybe 100 books, let alone my 5,000 books in Los Angeles. So forgive me for not being able to make more references. There would have been more references to Husserl. I think that, so I'm just going on the basis again of memory. I think that in the crisis text, Husserl does pretty clearly say that science has positioned itself as a kind of savior. Now, Husserl has great questions about science being able to save anyone. And that's, of course, the reason why this text is called the crisis, is that science has this both internal and external crisis, and it isn't able to save, it's not able to deliver, and thus, phenomenology comes to the rescue. So the short answer is, I think Husserl thinks that science isn't able to do this.
We had another one, sorry, I've been too quick in my reading. There was first, before I pass the word on to Olga, there was a question by Judika about intelligent design, and it came up very early during your talk. I wonder if, Judika, you want to catch up on that? If not.
No,
oh yeah, here you go.
Just a second. Actually, I just heard that there is a movement in the United States about intelligent design, and I just thinking, is it a movement from Christian circle or what? Or because I just it's very interesting. I think it's promoted by Stephen Mayer, and they try to try to bring the Christian value into science. But how far is that movement go to within the circle of education or university, both in Europe and the United States? That's my question, actually.
Thanks. That's a very clear question. So here's I think the reality. The book that brought this forward was Darwin's Black Box by Michael Behe. And Behe has taken a beating because what he's been accused of doing is importing God into the dialogue in a kind of surreptitious way. I would say that in the academic world, this is taken without any seriousness at all. I mean, to give you an idea, I mentioned that I taught at a school which is very conservative. So you might think, oh, well, very conservative school, they might be more inclined to be accepting of intelligent design. The reality is that my former colleague who worked precisely on this has exactly the same criticisms of the most secular people. So what's happened is that intelligent design has been smuggled into largely texts designed for Christian high schools, or else texts designed for high schools in conservative states like Arkansas, Texas, and things like that. But it is not taken seriously.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Olga has withdrawn her question, so I would pass on the word to James Mensch, who wrote it concisely down, but perhaps, James, you would give it some flesh, as it's about the resurrection.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
fine, perfect.
Okay, well, it's just simply about the resurrection of the body as mentioned at the end of the Apostles' Creed. I mean, how does the body figure into your notion of salvation and embodiment? I mean, I take it that you take salvation as a liminal notion of participating on the border of two different dimensions. Is that correct?
Yes, it is correct.
And so therefore I was wondering how you would interpret the body in those terms.
All right, so the first thing I'd say, I take it that your question really comes from a very specifically Christian point of view, and I was speaking largely from a Christian point of view. One of the difficulties with the history of Christianity is, and I assume you know this, is that it has not taken the body very seriously. The body is
No, it's adopted Plato's separation of body and soul.
correct. You know, so I have said elsewhere that, you know, if we're going to affirm what the Apostolic Creed says, that, you know, Jesus ascends into hell, then he would have done so bodily. I'm not sure exactly what that would mean, but we'd have to say that he did that in a bodily way rather than simply his soul went there. I take it that the Christian conception of the body is that salvation comes to the body that we have a resurrected body, but we do not become disembodied. The hope of salvation is never disembodiment, and it's also not a new body that is disconnected from the previous body. I don't know if this answers your question or what you're getting at here.
But see, I'm just inviting you to think about the liminal quality of the body phenomenologically, as how it plays into your concept of salvation as a liminal concept.
Okay.
The body is between both life and death.
Yes, it is. Well, thank you. It's a really thoughtful question. I mean, one way of thinking about the body, of course, is that it's constantly dying and coming alive. I think it's the cells in our mouths that within 7 days have completely changed. Depending on what part of the body, the cells die and they come alive. So there is constantly a life and death of the body. The Christian notion of salvation is not that death does not occur, but that death leads to a new body. And so the cycle of life and death is part of what it is to exist. So yeah, I don't know if that's answering what you're looking for.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I see Before I would like to pose a question myself, perhaps Michael Barber has right now posed the question. Michael, would you want to step in and formulate it online?
Sure. Thank you very much for your talk. My concern is that, I mean, I see what you're saying about, I think Nietzsche's critique of science and religion is actually exercising a great deal of power and then concealing it behind a veneer of piety or of sort of a truth, even, as a matter of fact, if you look at the genealogy of morals. But my concern is whether the dispersion of this point of view, which is widespread, has sort of contributed to a situation in which the right-wing media can propagate anything as true, supporting totally their own particular interests and values and things like that, as long as it's relative to their own particular group. And so that sort of the whole of rational discourse has just been dissolved in front of us.
Well, of course, so the first response would be, yes, that's exactly what's happened. One of the difficulties is earlier on in my career, I co-edited a book called Evangelicals and Empire, in which I had quite a broad range of theological voices respond to the books by Hart and Negri, Empire and Multitude. And of course, they were very positive about the idea, tapping into Foucault, that the internet and all kinds of things would allow for revolutions and from their point of view, for very liberal causes to be advanced. What they didn't see in that book at all, neither of these books see this, is that the other side, so to speak, was able to be advanced, and the difficulty was now that given the internet and given Fox News, it's entirely possible to put forward a view of truth that it has nothing to do with truth or reality at all. And so technology actually has served, it's very odd because, science is supposed to be about facts. That's sort of science 101. And yet the reality is that technology has allowed us to get to the place where nobody really knows what a fact is anymore. People can quite easily argue that something simply isn't the case. And when politicians, Trump is the kind of obvious example. When Trump lies, the sort of standard response is, well, all politicians lie.
Right. That's it.
And
yeah.
so therefore, nobody really knows what the truth is. And the problem is that science was supposedly supposed to save us from this. It was supposed to give us this monolithic truth that said, this is the way things are. But in fact, it's allowed all kinds of things to proliferate so that people at the end of the day don't really know what's true or not. I don't know if that's enough.
No, that's good. I still go back to Husserl's idea of, that you're responsible for responsibly exercising your judgment about what's the case. I mean, I grant you it's not popular. I wonder whether it can even be realized now.
Yeah, no, I actually talk about that in my my master's thesis on Husserl's theory of ideal objects, in which he talks about this kind of thing where I talk about it in terms of illiteracy, that we read something and we just very passively take over the view. And we don't really understand what it is we're taking over. I think this is actually what technology allows.
Yeah.
And one of the ways in which this really bothers me, I am probably like most of you on LinkedIn, but I'm only marginally on Facebook. But when I go on LinkedIn, I see this scroll of stuff. And my worry is this: not simply is any of this true, but simply nobody can possibly take in all of this. So what you do is you simply look at the headlines, you read a sentence or two, and then you move on to the next thing. And then you think you know. You now know what is the case. And this is my great worry about how technology feeds us information. And then of course, what I talked about with Google, giving us what we want, figuring out what we want, and in effect hiding from us the kind of stuff that we really need to see that would open our eyes. So, thank you. That's a great question.
Yeah, thank you also, Michael, for the question and also for the answer, Bruce. I think we have a couple of minutes more. We have a break scheduled. We started a little bit late. I think nobody will see a problem in that. We have time, and I think there's still questions. Jason posed one that appears to be very broad in its implications. Jason, would you want to step in?
Yeah, thanks, Bruce, for your talk. Right, I was trying to trace some of the threads that you were pulling from this science myth, unraveling it. And yeah, I picked up on your comment about metaphysical faith, this Platonic sense of metaphysical faith as a what seemed like one of the first groundings of the science myth. And then I picked up on your claim to passive nihilism, which also seemed like one of the other strands you were pulling from the sweater of the science myth. And then I picked up on your point about the human invincibility, this being something from the science myth that's been sort of injected into the Christian narrative, at least especially in, say, the American Protestant context. And I'm wondering how those things are connected in your view. Do you see those things as connected, or am I just building that castle?
So just to be clear before I attempt an answer, what things are we connecting? Just so I'm clear.
Your comment about passive nihilism,
right?
Platonic metaphysical faith, and then the invincibility narrative. Are these three of the core aspects of what makes up this the science myth?
They are. They all are. So the invincibility narrative. So it's very interesting. The invincibility narrative. Thanks for this question. It's making me think. The invincibility narrative, I think, in the U.S. is very much tied up with the whole idea of manifest destiny, the city on the hill, American exceptionalism, and so as far as I see this, let me just pick up on that. All of these things feed in together, so that American evangelicals and probably American Christians, even of more mainline denominations, have taken on this idea that God is with us. Therefore, God will bless our science. God will bless our politics. And so, and this is something I hinted at in the paper, but I didn't really go into. American evangelicals in particular have largely bought into the whole American project of invincibility, and so it is ultimately nihilistic in that sense. I don't know if I should say any more, given that it's 2 minutes after the hour, but
it's fine. I think we have a couple of minutes. We have, in fact, as to the schedule, we will start at 5:40. So I guess if the discussion is going that well, we should consider all the questions that have been posed. We have one, sorry for misspelling. I see Victor Fail has raised his hand. Please.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. I was just interested in your creation of the eschatological dimension of Jesus's teaching on the kingdom of God. But there's always been a dimension of the Zwischenzeiten, of living between times.
yes, there is.
In any, not only within that, but in Jewish eschatology and
Yes.
numerous others. I'm just curious as to not so much whether we are living in that in end times, or at least having to deal with these between times, but do you get a sense that perhaps Christianity in any form cut itself off from the fragility of this in-between time? And is it not true that perhaps there are scientists who are very aware that we don't have a solution to all things, and we are living at a time where old formulas of science and technology are not working, and we just don't know where the new is coming? It's that sense of fragility that I didn't quite hear you attributing to Jesus's message, which is core also to the early church.
Okay, I'm sorry that I didn't communicate that. I talked about Jesus talking about the kingdom of heaven and the fact that he constantly reformulates it. And the reason I was saying that he constantly reformulates it is I think he realizes he's providing a radical, disturbing message. And so if you think about it, you know, all of the things when he says the kingdom of heaven is like, they're all very disturbing. I mean, you know, for instance, just take the parable of the people who get hired at different times and they discover that, you know, that they all get the same wage. This is a very disturbing message. The way the world works is, you know, you put in your amount of time, you get paid, you know, per hour, and that's how it is. And Jesus is saying the kingdom of heaven isn't like this at all. So I think that Jesus' message is fundamentally disturbing. I think there's a good reason why, particularly in the Gospel of Mark, you have the disciples continually saying, who is this guy? What in the world is he talking about? They're constantly, it's, you know, Mark, as you know, is the earliest gospel. And you know, it's the gospel of surprise. They constantly don't know what's going on. Now, my experience, at least in the evangelical world in the US, and I suspect, because I've spent some time in the evangelical world across the world, and unfortunately, well, maybe I should just say, for better or for worse, American evangelicalism has been exported pretty widely, so that a lot of American evangelical ideas are to be found in the evangelical world at large in the global South. So you have this relatively safe idea of what Christianity is. And I think the reason that they're able to do that, I talked about a Prozac hermeneutic, it's because so many of the passages, I'm speaking about my own growing up, my own interaction with American evangelicals and evangelicals across the world. So many of the passages that are disturbing are not seen as disturbing. They're seen as relatively clear. I mean, even the born again thing, which is like the most basic evangelical, you know, sort of thing, Nicodemus's response to this is, what in the world is this? And yet I find that the typical evangelical response is, well, that's obvious. But when you read the text, you realize it's not obvious at all. What does this mean? And so I think it's there. I think that what happens is we find this message disturbing, so we just tend to, you know, get rid of all the disturbing bits. Yeah, shall I stop there?
Thank you, Bruce. Olga is back in the game.
Great.
We don't hear you.
Okay, hi. First of all, thank you, Bruce. I remember that in our prior dialogues, you tried to break sort of out of Christianity, or break the confinement of Christianity, or the hold that it has on philosophy of religion. And I don't mean to ask you to go comparative now, but the question that I have is, science is based on self-evident truth that science and Christianity, or Judeo-Christianity, are the same intellectual tradition, or, you know, one may be preceding the other in a sense. So we are clearly facing the crisis of science outlined by Husserl, but it still continues. I think it worsens significantly despite
Yes,
of the increase in knowledge. it's a wrong kind of knowledge. So to what degree this Christian or Judeo-Christian backgrounds contribute to the deviation? You know, Husserl brings up geometry and space-time, Aristotelian kind of hieratic foundation, but we do have the whole moral foundation, the whole worldview really transplanted into science and then rationalized to the degree, but the reason is pretty much the Christian reason which operates in it. So are we in this hole with pandemics due to this, or what's the connection? Or can yeah, I mean the science is bankrupt with pandemics so far. I mean, to a significant degree, you know. So is it the intellectual legacy that it's grew out of, or is it a too blatant to a linear assumption and things are different?
So are you asking whether science has formulated itself in light of Christianity and Judaism, or are you asking a different question?
Well, I assume that science formulated itself in light of Christianity and Judaism, period.
Yeah.
Having this assumption as a working assumption, if we make a next step and look into how science handles pandemics, which I will be talking about, actually, we pretty much see a bankruptcy, both in terms of scientific means of handling it and in terms of science's standing in the society. So,
okay, all right.
Yeah, what's the deal?
Got it. Yeah. So the deal. Well, you probably will tell us more about what the deal is, but
no, I'm just
for the moment. I think it's really interesting because I completely agree that science has taken over the Salvific mythos of Christianity or Judaism, or you could even say other religions. I don't think all religions are necessarily salvific in their the basic structure, but some people do think that. It's taken that over, but the problem is this: science has no positive. It only has negative freedom. Freedom from this, freedom from that. It doesn't have any positive sense of freedom. Now, I was arguing earlier that at least in my upbringing in the evangelical world, I didn't see much in the way of positive freedom either. What was presented to me was largely a kind of negative freedom. You're not supposed to do this. You're not supposed to do that. And there was very little in terms of we are freed in order to. Science has absolutely no idea of freed in order to. Just there's nothing that science has. All that science has is, and if you think about it, the kinds of things that science talks about, freeing us to is, I gave this example of, human growth hormone that would help us to live, eternally.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about you, but that living eternally in this form, in this body, doesn't sound like a good thing. I have no desire to do that. That sounds really like an awful thing. But my point is that's kind of the best that science can think of. It just thinks of what is already the case and how it can be prolonged. And if you think about it, it's the same thing with medical science. All medical science can do is prolong life. So you have people who, really in any kind of natural sense, and I realize the word natural is highly contested, but in any kind of natural sense, it would have been much better if they simply had died 10 years earlier than have their life prolonged, so they live in such a way, in such a way that they are basically not really even alive. So science doesn't have anything to offer in this respect. But the problem is that if you hear how many times people will say, well, we just need to do what science tells us to do. And yet the problem is that science also doesn't understand anything in terms of how, so if we're just talking about negative freedom, science doesn't really have much of an answer when it comes to the pandemic. Scientists are just making this up as they go along. Why 6 feet? Well, because people thought that would, be about right.
Exactly.
Why a 4-week plan rather than a 6-week plan? Well, because people guess that that's probably a good thing to do. So when I hear this, well, science will just tell us, I think, oh, well, the scientists, they don't know either. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's what you're getting at.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Bruce. I think it's already 5:15. We will go on at 5:40, and I would just like to thank you, Bruce, for this inspiring talk and for, well, having opened many pathways for further discussion. I'd be especially interested to get to know a little bit more about the Husserlian lineage and heritage. Husserl wrote so many interesting things in The Crisis, where especially I think about, well, it's not scientism that will, perhaps it will deliver us from many constraints and many intricacies of our condition, but it will not save us to something, as you formulated it. That is one thing I'd completely emphasize and agree with on Husserl. But Husserl is also interesting because he becomes very self-critical in The Crisis when he talks about reason, when he talks about spirit becoming eternal, being the only eternal. And that's something that is epitomized in the quest, not of reason per se, but for reason. So reason is something in the becoming. It's like reason in statu nascendi, which has to be recovered again and again. He's a philosopher of, let's say, infinite tasks, and there in light of Kant, that makes a lot of sense. But what's interesting to me is today we are standing at some really abysmal point where we really have to ask this age-old question: what was truth? What was truth? We don't have it anymore. We've discussed about that. And then we go back to Husserl and see that Husserl in The Crisis struggle to retain the unity of reason. He tells us, well, reason is not one, reason is many. And that's interesting. That's like something we've heard about Caputo earlier on. Well, forget about rationality, forget about instrumental rationality, forget about reason becoming instrumental, because, well, is there religious truth? That's one question. The other question is, can we have a kind of non-indifferent reason that will save us to something? That's really interesting. That's hot stuff, I think, for the phenomenologists to come. So thanks again, Bruce. Thanks for all the questions and for keeping the discussion going so well.
Thank you,
Mike,
everyone.
Yes, Olga, please.
Michael, so when do we start next session? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I'm confused.
I've got the program here as it's been posted on the website. It says 5:40 with your presidential address.
So my presidential address, highly anticipated. Well, I'm joking. In 22 minutes approximately, right?
Exactly. That's
something
exactly
like this. Okay.
That's wonderful. I think we get a good break. Everybody back to coffee or tea or anything else that helps us getting over the day in good shape. It's a pleasure to hand over as my voice is getting a bit worse. So I'm happy that it's at that point of the day. Thanks for taking over.
Here we are. It is the late afternoon session, evening session for me in Europe. Others, Olga, it's the first thing in the morning. With Olga, she is the president of the Society of Religious Experience, and she is one of our co-organizers with this, with us webinar, and she will also be with us next year when we are all meeting next September. I believe we've put it on the calendar. But for now, Olga, we've listed it as your, maybe you, based on your title, it sounds like maybe you might want to challenge the idea of presidents, the authority of president in general.
The authority of president in general?
The authority of presidents in general, perhaps, yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Well,
the floor is yours, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. So let me share screen. Okay. And move the chat window for a second. Can you see the screen well? I turn it on to the full screen. Okay,
We see
thank
it
you.
fine.
Okay, good. So I will just spend a moment on introducing the society for those of us who are not familiar with this history. So this is a very young organization. We started in 2016 with the first conference on phenomenology of religious experience at the Graduate Theological Union. And I called this conference, but the idea was in the air, so to say, because everybody was excited about the topic. And upon the consensus of everybody at the conference, Sophere was established. And since then, we were going non-stop. We had 3 more conferences, published collective works for issues of open theology. And now we have several conferences and book releases planned. So for those of you who do not know about the society, please check our website, and by all means, please get involved with our work. So that said, I'd like to turn to much more complicated and, so to say, burning matters. The way we approach reason and philosophy in the society is to take as a grounding foundation the givenness of religious experience. This is sort of a working assumption. And this working assumption feeds into ideas that authentic religious experiences, the study of those experiences, holds keys to some of the major problems of today. So here I'm showing on this very busy slide, I'm showing some operating concepts. So first of all, religious experience can be distinguished as having 2 forms. This distinction can be established both empirically and phenomenologically. And so one finds differences between interpretive forms of religious experience and those which can be categorized as originary, self-giving, which I call here authentic forms of religious experience. And then when one has those authentic forms of religious experience taking place, it's clear in the analysis especially that they include generation of ontological validities. Those experiences, they constitutively include metaphysical intuitions regarding the structure of reality. Husserl referred to those moments as intimations of transcendence, but he didn't have enough life left, so to say, to focus on this experience, on this topic. He believed that the method itself needs to be upgraded and developed more before those forms of experience can be addressed. So these are assumptions about experience, and now I'm moving to the right column here, assumptions regarding reason. So there is sufficient research now, and this research, of course, goes back to original Aristotelian vector of logic. But this research shows that logic is essentially grounded in metaphysics. These are especially studies in intentional logic, like in Zalta, in realistic logic, like in Rush, in semantic logic, for example, Kripke's semantic worlds. But Husserl himself, and that is, I believe, following Lotze, indicates that intentionality of consciousness includes ontological validities. And these realistic metaphysical roots of logic are not necessarily will be linked to observable objects or any kind of objects, but they can include non-objectifiable relationships. And then there is again a lot of literature on this, especially in the contemporary studies on metaphysics. I mean, relationships we can objectify as turn them into abstract objects, but in their own reality, or as we live them, they are non-objects. So that feeds into generation of those ontological validations, and this is especially important because self-givenness or religious experience specifically doesn't necessarily include objectification. I mean, we objectify it reflectively, but the original self-giving is non-objectifying because God is not an object. You know, that's the main argument against the possibility of these experiences, but this argument is dealt with by this non-objectifiable forms of logic. So the suspension of ontological validations of metaphysical propositions leads to incoherence of judgment. And this is a thesis which, of course, here number E, under E. This is the thesis which requires much more exposition, so I can here only point to it. But as an example of how this works, one can take the difficulties that people experience about thinking about intentional object. Intentional object is the real object, but one exists and the other doesn't. So we have to do something with ontological validations in thinking about those objects, and that is very difficult for the reason. So, of course, these propositions need to be verified, and much more analysis has to go into this, but the conclusion can be made, a conclusion already based on what I said, that insofar as the structure of thinking corresponds to the structure of the world, the forceful bracketing of metaphysical intuitions of any kind, and in particular of a religious kind, ends up in creating ruptures in our understanding of the world, and consequently in reasoning and even in logic itself. Let me see if I can get rid of chat here, but I think that you probably don't see it here. So when we bracket religious forms of experience out of our thinking about the world, we may end up with an inadequate picture of the world, not because that there is necessarily God in the world, but because the way human logic works, in order for it to be adequate or correlate with the world, it has to have the full spectrum of metaphysical propositions available to it to work off. So that's a working assumption. Now, if I can get out of this slide. Okay, here we go. Now we can turn to the matters of pandemics. And let's see, okay. So here now I can see my own slide. So I'm comparing on this slide two kinds of parameters. Death rate, which is the percent of death among those who were infected, and death toll, the total of deaths in an affected area, affected by pandemics. And what kind of pandemics are we talking about? Basically, here I present the history of pandemics as it stands primarily in the Western world, but some of it crosses over with data that we have on the history of the Eastern world, or formerly Eastern world before globalization. So pandemics, they begin as early, or the records of them that we have begin as early as 430 BCE, before Common Era. Trying to get my pointer to work here. And then there is, in the beginning of the first millennium, there is the Antonine plague, then approximately 550 AD Justinian plague, and then of course medieval Black Death plague. So then the 20th century kicks in. 1918, Spanish flu, 1980 AIDS, 2001 SARS, 2009 swine flu, 2014, 2016 Ebola, then Zika, and then now COVID. So, so what you can see is gradually going down is the death rate. So if the certain amount of people is infected, certain percent will certainly die. This is gradually getting less, as these are all data that are very difficult to standardize, because of course we don't have the actual numbers for the plague of Athens or Justinian plague, but we can compare based on historical records, and those records are primarily in religious sources actually. So what we can see that this blue parameter is going down, but actually not as significantly as we would expect. For the first year of COVID here globally, we have the same death rate actually that would be typical of the Black Plague, or death rate or death toll. Well, let me just consider compare the numbers. So the Black Plague lasted approximately 100 years, and the loss is loss of life is about 100 million people, 100 to 150 million people over this time. Now, for the first year of pandemics, we lost about 1 million people worldwide. So we lost per year worldwide the same number of people that we lost per year for the affected area during the medieval Black Plague. And if you think about those numbers this way, this is not much of the scientific progress that has been happening. So our means of dealing with pandemics, with the spread of infectious disease, still remains quarantine. And quarantine was invented during the time of the Black Plague as observations. Of course, there is vaccination probably, but that's not as effective with viruses, especially with COVID, as we would like it to be. And so the policy remains the policy of containment. Okay, so now this graph is taken from journal Nature, and it shows the global scientific output, which is the amount of publications, which doubles every 9 years, beginning from the 17th century. So this is the exponential curve. Now, if we overlap this graph with the pandemics data, we see that there is the rise of scientific publications, the rise of science, the rise of the scientific output. And this includes, of course, the Green Revolution, the decade of the brain, so all those wonderful achievements of science at the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century. But we don't have too much going on in terms of the pandemics. I mean, our capacity of dealing with pandemics in terms of the death toll and death rate remains very much the same that it was in the medieval world and close to what we had in the ancient world, except for that we are better in treatment, but we are on the same turf and on the same terms with infectious agent that we were millennia ago. So pandemics are the main factor shaping societies and histories, yet remarkably little attention is given to them in social science and behavioral medicine. It's less than 4% of all papers which is dedicated to this rapid spread of infectious diseases in the form of pandemics. And whatsoever no attention has been given to the ways plague relate to consciousness of afflicted societies. Now, if we look at this set of data, so here I present in the chart on the right ranking of publications in natural science. It's again Nature Index 2020, which shows, this table shows how high is the output of the scientific publication in general countries. And I selected from the chart the countries which are specifically those of all of us who are speaking in this webinar. The chart itself includes 50 countries. But so here is the selection, and you see, of course, that the United States is on the top of the list. Then comes China, then actually it's not in the list, but then Germany, and then United Kingdom and Japan. Now, on, Russia is number 18th, and then Iran and Turkey closer towards the end of the list. So the countries ranked highest in scientific input are in this blue chart, but here on the left, we have the picture of the world, which it shows the share of COVID-19 tests which are coming out positive. Why is this important? Because we do not know how many total cases are there. We can only monitor pandemics through the ratio of testified versus confirmed cases. So there is X amount tests which has been done, and then so many come positive. And that's how we know what kind of spread is happening in the country, because the higher the ratio, the more cases went unnoticed and underreported. So the countries which do not know the degree of spread and how viruses behaving in their country are here in red. That's the worst case scenario, and then in orange, that's the second bad case scenario. So that you can see that the United States, which is the top on this list and supposedly should be the leading country in terms of its science, here ranks among the worst in terms of the knowledge about the pandemics. Same about India, number 12 on the list of the scientific output, missing the spread, missing the information about the spread. What else here is quite remarkable? France, Spain, all these countries, they will be in the same category. So we see a discrepancy. The development in science, or the development of scientific reason absolutely does not correspond to the ways the country's success in handling the pandemics. So the last parameter that I would like to share is the so-called bending the curve. Bending the curve shows whether the country can control the spread, or whether the country is just riding the wave, and meaning the spread controls the country. So the best in bending the curve, the earliest and the most successful were South Korea and Vietnam. If you remember the spread, they are not even in the list. They didn't even make it into the list regarding the effectiveness of their science. Now, the countries which are most effective in terms of their science, which is India, United States, then you have Russia here, United Kingdom, they are catching up very late with this bending the curve process. And so the offshoot of this is that they are not really coping with the pandemics. They have no control over the spread of the virus. And that, together with the previous data, tells us about the capacity of the contemporary science to deal with vital questions of human life. So I'll proceed to conclusions. And so the fact is that societies deal with rapidly spreading pandemics first with great interest, horror, and panic, and then as soon as infection begins to subside, with lack of interest, until the new wave of extinctions is knocking at the door. And so what we are doing at present, we are repeating, in fact, those vicious cycles. So in his early genetic analysis of sciences in Prolegomena, Husserl tried to identify the types of reason which goes into the formations of science. And so he talks about the normative propositions of practical reason, which serve as or must serve as the foundation of science. So we can say that our collective reason has really failed to come up with what appears to be a logically necessary maxim, that is a normative proposition which would assert that humanity should not be subject to massive fatality events due to emergent infectious agents. We simply don't have a science, a kind of science, which would have captured this phenomena. We discern no ontological region of sciences which would be concerned with the endurance of life as such. And so as a result, what we have is the situation that our practical sciences are inefficient and eidetic and regional ontologies are insufficient. And this insufficiency is probably due to what I was talking about in the beginning of this talk, which is cutting out metaphysical assumptions which do not fit with the dominant paradigm. So the situation with pandemics only highlights how unreasonable we are regarding our own life. We deal with pandemics as a synthetic event, a subject to partisan and nuclear responses, and our analytic fragmented metaphysics is thereby foundationally flawed. Well, and the proposal that I want to make is that, by contrast, reason which would be rooted in the metaphysical unity of life, which comes through in certain forms of religious experiencing, may give us a clue to dealing with such emergent existential threats. Okay, thank you.